You know that moment people talk about, the one where something inside you just clicks, like a switch gets flipped you never even knew was there? That happened to me about 30 seconds after Glenn Tarver, my boss of 11 years, fired me. I wasn't even out of my funeral suit yet. Let me back up. My name's David Reese. 38. Until recently, I was the operations manager at Forge Field Construction, one of the larger mid-sized contractors in the Pacific Northwest. I'd worked there since I was in my 20s. Ran the logistics like a Swiss train schedule, made the place more money than I'll ever see in 10 lifetimes, and never asked for a damn thing in return. Loyalty was my religion. 3 days before the big moment, I buried my dad. Lung cancer. Fast, brutal, and quiet like most of the men from his generation. My old man was a carpenter. Taught me everything I knew about building houses, trust, a work ethic that could split stone. He wasn't flashy. Didn't believe in debt or weakness. But he believed in me. So you'll understand why I wasn't exactly in top spreadsheet form when I showed up to the office Monday morning after the funeral, still wearing the same black suit and a 3-day hangover of grief. Glenn called me into his office without even a nod of condolence. No small talk. Just this little dismissive wave. Sit. He didn't even look up when he said it. Just said, "I'm going to have to let you go, David. Budget realignment. We're moving in a different direction." Let me be clear, I was the direction. Everything Forge Field did right, I built the systems for. Glenn made deals and did the wine and dine routine, but the house was mine. Every beam, every screw, every margin saved, it had my fingerprints all over it. I didn't say a word. Not then. Not when he said he'd recommend me if asked, not when he handed me a folder with the HR contact's name misspelled, and not even when I passed Mason, yes, that Mason, the brown-nosing paperweight who once asked me if concrete came in colors. I didn't even blink when I saw him already sitting at my desk. But here's the thing. While Glenn saw me as just another name on a ledger, he didn't realize 2 things. I don't get mad. I get methodical. I had a plan B, C, and D the moment Mason started sniffing around my job 6 months ago. That switch? The one I mentioned earlier? It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was calculation. Because I already knew Forge Field's skeletons. Because I already knew Glenn's weak spots. Because I already knew exactly who would love to see that smug bastard fall. I walked out of that building without saying a word. But in my head, a clock started ticking. And every second that passed brought me one step closer to burning it all down with nothing but truth, leverage, and a dash of legally admissible vengeance. The day after Glenn fired me, I sat at my kitchen table in the same black suit, sipping blacker coffee, replaying every interaction I'd had with Mason over the last year. The man thought cost engineering meant switching to cheaper coffee in the break room. But there was something else, something that didn't sit right. Mason had this habit of bragging just a little too loudly, usually after 3 beers at company happy hours. 6 months ago, he'd let something slip about streamlining subcontractor invoices in the break room. I remember raising an eyebrow. He'd laughed it off with just smoothing out the bumps for Glenn. Which, if you speak fluent corporate douchebag, loosely translates to, "I'm doing something illegal but haven't figured out how badly yet." Back then, I didn't press. But now? Now I had nothing but time and a man-sized grudge. So I dug. See, when I left Forge Field, I walked out quietly, but I didn't leave empty-handed. I had a personal copy of the operational templates I'd built over the years. All legal, by the way. Glenn never had me sign an IP contract, because why bother protecting your kingdom when you think your throne is eternal? Included in those files were access logs. Boring stuff to most people. But to me, they were gold. Buried in a shared drive backup, I found Mason's streamlining folder. He wasn't even smart enough to encrypt it, just renamed it Q4 Forecast. Rookie move. Inside? Invoice discrepancies. Subcontractor payments that didn't match job reports. Vendor names that didn't exist anywhere on Forge Field's approved supplier list. And my personal favorite, 3 checks cut to a company called Northlight Materials LLC. I looked it up. Guess whose name was on the articles of incorporation? Yup. Mason. His wife was listed as the registered agent. That was when I laughed for the first time since my dad's funeral. Not a happy laugh, more like the kind you let out when you realize the building is on fire, but you already moved your valuables out last week. I called an old friend, Joanna Clemens, investigative reporter. Used to cover real estate and development scandals before she went full-time freelance. We'd helped her break a zoning abuse story 5 years ago. I gave her what I had and said, off the record for now. Just follow the paper trail. Then I called Alan Cho. Alan's a venture capitalist who once pitched Glenn on buying a stake in Forge Field. Glenn, being Glenn, blew him off with a condescending comment about Silicon Valley kids who've never held a hammer. Alan remembered. So when I called him and said, "How do you like to buy a construction firm's biggest rival?" he was very interested. We agreed to meet in person. I had a presentation prepared by the next morning. It was part numbers, real margins, site logistics, and 3 slides about Forge Field's crumbling leadership. By the time our meeting ended, Alan leaned back in his chair and said, "You really want to destroy them, don't you?" I looked him straight in the eye. "No. I want to buy them. Then destroy the parts that deserve it." He laughed, nodded once, and said, "Let's begin." Next up, the resurrection of Iron Light Group and how I turned a dying brand into a loaded weapon. Iron Light Group was like an old boxer, battered, broke, but still technically breathing. Back in the 90s, they were the name in regional construction. Big city hall projects, highway contracts, stuff that made the news. But they got outpaced, outplayed, and outnetworked by leaner firms like Forge Field. Alan Cho had already done his homework. They've got real estate, aging equipment, and 24 union contracts they haven't touched in years, he told me over lunch. But if anyone can drag them back from the dead, it's you. I wasn't interested in dragging. I wanted to weaponize. Alan and his people bought Iron Light at pennies on the dollar. I came in not as CEO but as strategic director, which is corporate speak for the man behind the curtain. I didn't want a spotlight. I wanted freedom. The first 3 weeks were trench work. Cleaning house. The boardroom was full of guys who still printed their emails and said things like, "Let's fax this." I offered generous retirement packages to some. The rest? Shown the door with a legal handshake and a smile I didn't mean. Once I had the keys, I started over. We streamlined vendor lists. I poached the best PMs from smaller firms with promises of autonomy, decent pay, and no Glens hovering over their shoulder. I upgraded the tech stack, killed the paper-based filing system. Hell, I even redid the damn logo because nothing says we're back like a rebrand that doesn't look like it was made in Microsoft Paint. Within 2 months, Iron Light had 3 mid-tier municipal contracts, a partnership with a solar roofing company, and a fleet of project trucks with 0 engine trouble for once. We weren't flashy. We were efficient. Exactly the opposite of Forge Field, which thanks to Mason's promotions and Glenn's visionary leadership was now bleeding talent like a horror movie victim. Then came the real move. Forge Field relied on 3 key subcontractors to deliver their bread and butter projects: concrete, framing, and HVAC. They'd squeezed these guys for years on margins. I reached out to each one quietly, respectfully, and with slightly better terms. Not enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to get them thinking. I didn't ask them to jump ship. I just told them that if they were ever looking for alternatives, Iron Light would treat them like partners, not liabilities. You'd be amazed how fast decades of cheap but good enough loyalty dissolves when someone offers dignity. And Glenn? Glenn had no idea. I made sure Iron Light kept a low profile. Our projects were outside his radar. We didn't touch residential or big box retail. Yet, Mason was still posting on LinkedIn about embracing innovation while cutting corners and outsourcing everything he didn't understand. Glenn was still playing golf with local council members, oblivious to the fact that Iron Light had already outbid Forge Field on 2 medium-sized contracts, ones Glenn didn't even know they'd lost yet. But the piece de resistance? The 1-2 punch? That was still coming. I just needed the right contract, the right moment, and the right scandal to make the whole empire Glenn built crack like drywall in a storm. And wouldn't you know it, Mason, bless his useless soul, gave me exactly what I needed. The great thing about people like Mason? They always think they're the smartest guy in the room until the room turns into a courtroom. I wasn't even looking for it when the match dropped into my lap. It started with a subcontractor named Neil Bell, owner of a framing outfit that Forge Field used on half their projects. Neil was a quiet guy, all sawdust and stoicism, but he always had this twitchy eye around Mason. I ran into him at a trade expo where Iron Light had a modest booth, no banners, no models in hard hats, just plans and progress. We made small talk. Then he asked, "Forge Field still using Northlight?" My ears perked up. "Northlight?" I said, feigning ignorance. Yeah, that vendor Mason started using a year ago for pre-cuts and lumber sourcing. Weirdest setup. Checks came from Forge Field, but shipments always came late or half-filled. Told Glenn, and he just shrugged. I nodded, kept it casual, but inside, the chessboard shifted. Northlight Materials LLC. The same shell company I'd found in Mason's poorly hidden shared folder. And now I had a real-world link, an active subcontractor, still working under Forge Field's contracts, who had noticed things. So I started stringing it together. I looped back with Joanna, my journalist contact. We pulled the vendor registration docs from the state database. Sure enough, Northlight Materials was owned by one Melissa Tran, Mason's sister-in-law. Not wife, not cousin. Just far enough removed to look innocent to a lazy auditor, but dumb enough to still share a holiday table. I had Joanna start digging through project permits and city filings. Found 3 bids where Forge Field had submitted material costs through Northlight that were at least 20% higher than market rates. And this was the cherry on one job. The city had already flagged inconsistencies and issued a formal warning. Forge Field ignored it. I compiled everything. Timelines. Wire transfers. Invoices. I even printed out a few of Mason's LinkedIn posts with vague, idiotic lines like streamlining procurement through trusted niche suppliers, which now read like confessions written in Helvetica. Then I tipped off an anonymous email to the Office of Public Contracting in our city. Attached the documents. Cited Northlight. Asked if Forge Field was being audited for vendor abuse. They weren't. But they were now. By the following week, Glenn was on damage control mode and Mason had gone radio silent online. No more motivational quotes. No more team synergy photos. Just crickets. Ire Light? We were busy bidding on the very same contracts Forge Field was about to get blacklisted from. It was surgical. No drama. No firebombing. Just slow, systematic erosion like termites in the beams. And here's where it got better. Because right around this time, Alan looped me in on something huge. Forge Field's cash flow was tanking and they had a balloon payment due on their main credit line. Their bank was considering freezing the line unless they secured 3 new contracts in the next quarter. Contracts that Iron Light was already favorite to win. Forge Field was bleeding from the gut and they didn't even know where the knife came from. But I did. And I was just getting started. I could have waited longer. I could have let Forge Field twist in the wind, slowly eroding until their name was just another whisper of poor management and embezzled potential. But that wasn't the point. See, Glenn didn't just fire me, he humiliated me. Right after I'd buried the man who taught me how to build. The man who taught me that when you cut someone down, you'd better be damn sure they don't have the blueprints to rebuild. So I didn't want Forge Field to rot. I wanted to acquire it. I wanted Glenn to hand me the keys himself, eyes wide with the slow, dawning realization that the guy he discarded like office clutter was now the one making him an offer he couldn't refuse. Alan made the first move. He sent a soft acquisition proposal to Forge Field's board, a friendly buyout structure to help Glenn transition to a strategic role while Iron Light consolidated market presence. Glenn, true to form, laughed it off. He replied with something smarmy about not selling to the JV team. He CC'd his board. A power move meant to shame us. Which was perfect, because that same board had already seen their Q3 reports. Project delays. Subcontractor revolts. Audit notices. A $3.4 million municipal contract pulled due to vendor irregularities. Their investor relations director had resigned a week before. Half their top field supervisors were now working for me at Ironlight. When we made a second offer, this time publicly, through Ironlight's legal team, they didn't laugh. They panicked. Forge Field stock, yes, they were technically private but traded over the counter, dropped 22% in a week. The contractor forums lit up with speculation. I stayed quiet. Alan stayed surgical. And then Glenn did something I didn't see coming. He called me. Personally. I was walking Scout, my dog, a German shepherd with better instincts than most executives, when the call came through. I didn't answer. Let it go to voicemail. Here's what he said, word for word. David, listen. I don't know what's going on with this Iron Light stuff, but we should talk. I think cooler heads can figure something out that works for everyone. Call me back. I saved the voicemail. Not for legal reasons. Just because I liked the sound of it. Glenn sounding small. I didn't call back. Instead, we submitted a formal acquisition letter through council. This time, we included conditions. Glenn stays on for 90 days as a transitional consultant, reporting to our new executive leadership, me. Mason gets retained, but in a new floating role, officially titled Documentation Coordinator, unofficially assigned to a corner with no team, no reports, and a broken desk chair. A clause in the merger paperwork requiring Glenn to issue a public statement thanking David Reese, full name, for his leadership, vision, and commitment to operational excellence. Alan called it petty. I called it precise. The board caved. Glenn folded. Fairfield became ours. At the closing meeting, Glenn sat across from me, pale and blinking too much, like a man still hoping this was just a nightmare he'd wake up from. I wore a gray suit. No tie. Same watch my dad wore to job sites for 30 years. He slid the final signed document across the table. I took my time signing it, then looked up at him and said, "Guess we are moving in a different direction after all." He didn't respond, just gathered his papers and left. The room stayed quiet long after the door closed. But in my head, I could hear the nails going into the coffin of the empire he'd built on arrogance. I didn't think I'd enjoy watching Glenn spiral. Honestly, I didn't expect to feel anything at all. But as it turns out, seeing your old boss, once a man who thought he ran the universe, try to smile through meetings where he's the least powerful person in the room? That hits different. Let me paint you the picture. Glenn, once the king of Forge Field, was now on the payroll of Iron Light Group, my Iron Light Group, as a strategic consultant. Which meant he got to attend board meetings where no one asked for his opinion, sit in on calls where decisions were already made, and worst of all, he reported directly to me. Every Monday at 10 a.m. we had a consultation sync. That's where Glenn would shuffle into my office, holding a notepad like a middle schooler who forgot his homework. He'd start with something like, "I had some thoughts about your shift in supplier relationships," and I'd cut him off, saying something like, "Already closed the new deal last Thursday. But thanks, Glenn." Anything else? He always looked a little smaller walking out than he did walking in. And Mason? Oh, Mason. Let me introduce you to his new kingdom, a glorified storage closet we rebranded as Workspace 2B. No window, no printer, and one of those office chairs with a broken wheel so it always rolled backward when you tried to sit. Officially, he was documentation coordinator, but let's be honest, he was the ghost of a once smug sycophant. His inbox was full of tasks like scan these forms and update binder tabs. Nobody spoke to him unless it was to remind him the break room coffee was now self-funded. To make things sweeter, I had IT migrate all archived emails and project notes he'd been CC'd on over the years to a shared transparency folder titled Mason's Legacy. He didn't complain. He didn't dare. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. See, Glenn thought if he just kept his head down for those 90 days, he'd get to walk away quietly. Fade into the background, maybe spin his failure into some half-assed consulting brand for other failing executives. You know, the kind with a personal logo and a blog no one reads. But I had one last clause in that acquisition deal. One Glenn signed because he was desperate. He either didn't read it carefully or didn't think I'd enforce it. On day 85, I sent him a calendar invite. Subject, draft review, public statement. Location, main conference room. Attachments, statement_dearies.docs. It was already written. All he had to do was show up and read it in front of a few press contacts we'd accidentally looped in. He walked in that day wearing a stiff suit and a stiffer smile. I sat across from him, arms folded, and watched him scan the document. His eyes stopped halfway through the sentence. "I would like to personally thank David Reese for his unwavering commitment to operational excellence and his leadership in steering Iron Light Group into a new era of integrity-driven innovation." He blinked, swallowed. Then, to his credit, he read the whole damn thing. That afternoon, the statement went live on Iron Light's new website. Alan texted me a screenshot. All he wrote was, "Damn." That night, I went home, poured a drink, and played the audio file I'd secretly recorded of Glenn reading the statement out loud. Not for legal reasons. Just for me. Just to remember how a man who once fired me the day after my dad's funeral was now the mouthpiece for the future I built in his ashes. You can't just destroy a legacy, you have to erase it. Forge Field had meant something once. Not because of Glenn, but because of the hundreds of people who showed up every day with lunch in a cooler and dirt under their nails, building something real. They didn't deserve the fallout of Glenn's arrogance. But the brand? The name? That had to go. At the end of Glenn's 90-day humiliation tour, I called a full company meeting. It was held in what used to be Forge Field's main office, atrium, and overdesigned open space that Glenn once used for team synergy huddles. That day, we used it to make history. I stepped up to the mic with a calm smile. Alan was next to me. The new Ironlight executive team, real builders, not boardroom phonies, stood behind us. Some of you remember what this company used to be, I began. Some of you remember what it became. As of today, Forge Field Construction no longer exists. Murmurs spread through the room. I waited. We're moving forward under one name, Reese & Company. Some people clapped. Others just looked stunned. And I understood. But then I added. Every good builder knows that sometimes you have to tear down to rebuild. That's what we're doing. New values. New leadership. Same boots on the ground. I paused for effect. And we don't build on rotten foundations. That's when the applause became real. But the best part? We held a ceremonial retirement of the Forge Field brand. Symbolic, yes, but I made it real. I had Glenn's old company sign, this massive metal monstrosity that used to hang in the lobby, hauled out to the back parking lot. I handed the first sledgehammer to Carlos, one of our longest-tenured foremen. The same guy who used to get yelled at by Mason for improper shift tracking when the real issue was that Carlos didn't kiss ass. Carlos looked at me like, "Are you serious?" I just nodded. And he swung. 10 minutes later, the sign was a pile of twisted aluminum and shattered legacy. I didn't swing the hammer myself. That wasn't my role anymore. I just stood there, watching the last piece of Forge Field die under the boots of the men and women it had once taken for granted. Back inside, our new signage was already up. Reese & Company. Clean, black and silver lettering. Honest. Sharp. Built to last. That night, I went to the old Forge Field website and watched the redirect go live. Welcome to Reese & Company. Beneath it, a video of our crews breaking ground on a community center that Forge Field once declined to bid on because the margin was too tight. Sometimes revenge isn't about shouting or scheming. Sometimes it's about quietly replacing everything your enemies thought would outlive you. You ever watch a man try to start a fire using nothing but damp paper and pride? That was Mason in his final weeks. After the rebrand, most of the former Forge Field crew had either adapted or self-exited. I gave people chances, even ones who had side-eyed me in the break room when I was just the ops guy. But Mason? Mason was different. He didn't adapt. He festered. You could see it in the way he walked, like he was still waiting for someone to tap him on the shoulder and say, "All right, joke's over. Here's your power back." But the taps never came. Just cold shoulders and polite nods from people who now reported to people who respected me. Still, Mason had one thing left, desperation. And desperation mixed with misplaced ego makes people sloppy. Here's what he did. He tried to leak confidential documents to a local contractor gossip blog, a sad little WordPress page run by a fired union rep turned keyboard warrior. I got tipped off by one of their freelance writers who used to date my cousin. Small world. The leak? A bundle of outdated project budgets from 2 years ago and a spreadsheet labeled Q3 cutbacks that had already been made public during the merger. The smoking gun he thought he had? A heavily doctored screenshot of an email thread between Glenn, Mason, and me allegedly showing US discussing cutting corners on safety compliance. Except, the original email thread still lived on the archived Forge Field server. IT pulled it in 5 minutes. The doctored version had been modified in Microsoft Paint. Paint, for God's sake. The man could barely format a Word doc and thought he could forge corporate email headers? Amateur hour. I didn't call him in. I didn't send a warning. I just forwarded the email trail, the altered file, and the attempted blog submission which the writer kindly provided with metadata to HR, legal, and IT. That was 4 emails. Each of them more damning than the last. By the end of the day, Mason's badge was disabled, his company email shut off, and his desk contents boxed up by security. I wasn't even in the office when it happened. I was at a site walkthrough with our new HVAC partner, someone Mason once dismissed as too small-time for Forge Field standards. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Emily, my new chief of staff. He cried. Just a little. I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? Mason had spent a year trying to climb over me, then another 6 months pretending I didn't exist. In the end, he erased himself. We posted a company-wide update the next day. Please join us in wishing Mason the best in his future endeavors. His position has been phased out as part of ongoing cultural realignment. That's corporate speak for, we took out the trash and we're not sorry. After that, I never heard from him again. No angry emails. No burner accounts. Just silence. It was the most dignity he'd ever shown. After Mason's exit, things got quiet. Not in a bad way. More like the calm that comes after a storm finally runs out of rage. The office no longer felt like a pressure cooker with a timer. People smiled more. The field crews stopped looking over their shoulders. Hell, even the coffee tasted better, but that might have just been because we stopped buying the bargain bin blend Glenn insisted on. Reese and Company wasn't just stable. It was growing. We picked up 2 contracts in Eastern Washington, landed a long-shot federal green infrastructure grant, and had more job applicants than we could review. The reputation we were building wasn't just competitive, it was respected. Quiet competence, visible leadership. My dad would have liked that. Then, one rainy Thursday, I got a letter. Not an email. Not a DM. An honest-to-God, handwritten envelope slid under my office door by our mailroom intern. It was postmarked from Fort Worth, Texas. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. No return address. No dramatic signature. Just this. Dear Mr. Reese, you don't know me, but I know you saved my husband's job. He's a foreman who used to work for Forge Field. We were one of the families hurt when Glenn and Mason cut hours and juggled vendor pay. At the time, we thought it was just business as usual. We didn't know how close they were to sinking the whole ship. After you took over, the new contracts rolled in and his hours came back. So did his confidence. You gave us back our mortgage, our health insurance, and our Christmas plans. You may have had revenge in your heart, but we saw something else, leadership. Thank you. Grateful in Fort Worth. I read it twice. Then a third time. I didn't cry. But I did sit there, real still, for a long while. Holding that paper like it was heavier than it should be. It's funny. You can spend months plotting the downfall of a man who kicked you while you were down, set every domino just right, pull every string like a master puppeteer, and still feel like none of it matters. Not really. Not when the only thing you're chasing is a quieter mind. But that letter? That meant something. Because it reminded me that I hadn't just burned Forge Field to the ground, I'd built something better in its place. Something honest. Something real. Something that families in steel-toed boots could count on. That night, I pinned a letter on the bulletin board in my office. Right in the center. No plaque. No frame. Just push pins and truth. And every now and then when the days got long or the contracts piled up or some exec tried to flex a title they didn't earn, I'd look at it. Because yeah, revenge is sweet. But impact? That's permanent. It happened a year to the day after Glenn signed the company over. I wasn't planning anything special. No champagne toast. No commemorative press release. Just a long site visit out in Wenatchee, some bad diner coffee, and a quiet drive home. But fate or irony or maybe just poetic timing had one last card to play. I was walking out of a supplier expo downtown, blueprints under one arm, phone buzzing with site updates when I saw him. Glenn Tarver. Same stiff posture. Same too expensive suit tailored to hide the fact that time had started shrinking him. But the swagger? Gone. The glow of untouchable self-importance? Snuffed. He was standing by the hotel bar, talking to a younger guy in a cheap blazer who looked like he was half listening. Glenn kept gesturing toward the floor plan mock-ups, doing the whole, back when I ran things, routine. You could tell. I've seen that pitch before. So had the kid. I could have walked past him. I really could have. But something in me wanted to know. Not revenge. Just closure. So I waited until the kid drifted away, muttering something about a call to take. Then I walked up slow and quiet. Glenn. He turned. Saw me. Blinked once, then twice. A forced smile crawled onto his face like a wounded animal. David, he said, voice hoarse like it hadn't been used much. You look, well? I nodded. I am. He opened his mouth again. Paused. Maybe to offer some belated apology. Maybe to ask for something. But I was already shaking my head. Don't, I said. Not angry. Not smug. Just tired of the game. His mouth shut. For a moment, we just stood there. Him holding a half-empty glass of scotch like a shield. Me, arms folded, feeling nothing but clarity. You know, I said finally, my dad once told me a man reveals who he really is by what he does when no one's watching. Glenn flinched. Just slightly. I used to think you were ruthless, I continued. Now I know better. You were just scared. Of being average. He didn't argue. He couldn't. I nodded once more. Then walked away. No insults. No gloating. No revenge speech for the ages. Just silence. Because Glenn didn't need me to punish him. His life was the punishment. No more company. No more power. No more loyal team faking respect. Just a ghost clinging to stories no one cared to hear. As I stepped into the elevator, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. City Council approved the school expansion. You're clear to break ground. I smiled. That was the last piece. The final contract Forge Field once said wasn't worth the margin. Now it was our flagship project for the year. We broke ground 2 weeks later. And as I watched the first bulldozer roll across that open field, I didn't think about Glenn. Or Mason. Or revenge. I thought about my dad. And I thought we built something better. Not out of spite, but out of survival. Because sometimes the best revenge is not showing them what you destroyed. It's letting them live with what you rebuilt without them.